Hello, everyone. Today, we're delving into another disturbing case with you. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell to support its growth. The tragic tale of the Rose family stands out as one of the most perplexing and unsettling crimes to have occurred in recent American history. What makes this case particularly striking is not only its cold-heartedness and brutality, but also the shocking revelation that both the victims and the alleged perpetrators were closely related. Despite the passage of many years since the crime took place, and the fact that the perpetrator has long been serving a harsh prison sentence, numerous unanswered questions and enigmatic aspects of this narrative persist. Many continue to harbor doubts about the fairness of the court's verdict. Now, let's dive into the details. The Roses were an unremarkable, ordinary family residing in a small suburban community near Bristol, Tennessee. Prior to this incident, they had never drawn the attention of law enforcement. At the helm of the family were Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, an elderly couple who had shared their lives for over 4 decades. While the family included 2 adult daughters and 6 grandchildren, we will focus solely on those family members directly implicated in this high-profile case. So, during the time of the incident, the elderly proprietors, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, along with their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tioa Milhorn, and her husband, James, were present in the house and on the surrounding property. Additionally, the couple had 6 children, with 2 being the biological offspring of Tioa and James, while the other 3 were from a previous relationship. A neighbor girl had also joined them in the house for some playtime. It's noteworthy that Tioa and James, along with their children, had been residing in Tioa's parents' house for approximately 2 months as their own residence was undergoing renovations at that time. At a later point, another significant figure in this chain of events arrived at the house: 19-year-old Seth Denton. Seth was Tioa's eldest son, although his relationship with his mother and stepfather was severely strained, to put it mildly. They had avoided contact with each other, and their last encounter had ended tragically. According to accounts from neighbors, the family appeared to be quite content and prosperous. Tioa's marriage to James was reportedly a happy one, and James worked as an auto mechanic with a passion for restoring antique cars. Sadly, it was the Rose family's own household that became the site of a horrific incident. Law enforcement officers who responded to the call later described it as the most gruesome crime scene they had ever encountered, marking a dark chapter in the history of their normally tranquil county. The lifeless bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and her daughter Tasha, were discovered within the confines of their home, both victims of close-range gunshots. In the grim tableau, Tasha was found seated at the dining room table, while her mother lay sprawled on the floor, the refrigerator nearby. Adding to the tragic scene, James, Tasha's husband, lay gravely wounded on the doorstep, his injuries sending him urgently to the hospital. Despite the valiant efforts of medical professionals, James succumbed to his extensive internal injuries and severe blood loss. Remarkably, none of the children inside the house sustained any harm, suggesting they were not the intended targets of the assailant or happened to be out of their line of sight during the brutal assault. Shortly after the heinous crime, the police fielded 2 consecutive phone calls. The initial call came from the homeowner, Curtis Rose, who alleged that his eldest grandson, Seth, had committed the shooting before fleeing the scene. However, a subsequent call from Seth himself painted a contrasting narrative, laying the blame squarely on his grandfather, Curtis, for the entire tragedy. To further complicate matters, it was revealed that Seth had sustained a gunshot wound to his arm, inflicted by Curtis. Curtis, however, did not dispute this, asserting that he had been attempting to apprehend his grandson and prevent his escape from the scene of the harrowing event. The alleged perpetrator, Seth Denton, was apprehended at the hospital where he had sought medical attention for his wound. Subsequently, the investigation set out to reconstruct the chain of tragic events and uncover the truth surrounding the Rose family's household. Curiously, initially, only one version of events was considered in the investigation, with the second version receiving serious consideration only several years later. On the evening of August 29, 2015, at approximately 6 o'clock, residents in the vicinity of the crime scene reported hearing a volley of gunshots. Initially, the sounds went largely unnoticed, as the surrounding area included forests where hunting of wild animals and birds was permitted. Later, one observant neighbor recalled feeling a slight unease at the number of shots and the subsequent silence, though it did not raise immediate concern worthy of a police call. During the trial, another neighbor provided crucial testimony. In addition to the gunshots, he recalled hearing shouting, prompting him to step out onto his porch to investigate the commotion. As he looked in the direction of the disturbance, he witnessed a young man sprinting down the pathway from his neighbor's residence towards a car parked along the road. In pursuit of the young man was another individual, although due to obstructing trees near the road, the witness had an obscured view of the unfolding events. He managed to observe the young man hastily entering the car, after which 2 gunshots reverberated through the air. The car then hastily sped away. Only a few minutes later, the neighborhood was gripped by the piercing wails of sirens as police cars and ambulances converged on Rose's residence. Shortly thereafter, an air ambulance helicopter touched down on the lawn adjacent to the house, dispatched to transport the still-living James to medical attention. To the witnesses, it all felt like a scene straight out of a movie, leaving them bewildered and struggling to comprehend the events that had transpired. Upon the arrival of law enforcement officers, the elderly homeowner, clutching a firearm, met them at the scene. Another firearm belonging to him was later discovered in his bedroom. Curtis, the homeowner, proceeded to offer his account of the events, which became the foundation of the investigation and was initially regarded as the sole narrative. According to Curtis, the day in question had begun without any hint of trouble. His daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren had gathered at his and his wife's residence, along with a neighbor's child who had come over to play. Curtis himself had been occupied in his trailer, located in the backyard of the house. He had heard the distant sounds of gunshots, but like many of his neighbors, he had dismissed them, assuming they were merely the echoes of hunters in the nearby woods. Suddenly, Curtis's eldest grandson, Seth, appeared unannounced in the trailer, visibly agitated. Seth conveyed news of a tragic incident and implored his grandfather to call emergency services immediately. Without hesitation, Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he was immediately confronted by the lifeless bodies of his wife and daughter. His foremost concern was for the children in the house, who were found in another room, shaken but thankfully unharmed. Curtis swiftly led them to the rear of the house, ensuring they were shielded from the harrowing scene unfolding within. As Curtis urgently called for assistance, he noticed his grandson Seth hastily exiting the house and sprinting toward the nearby road. The homeowner swiftly grabbed his firearm and initiated pursuit, convinced that Seth was the assailant. As Seth leaped into a waiting car, Grandpa discharged 2 rounds. The first pierced the rear window, narrowly missing the driver, while the second struck Seth in the left shoulder. Despite his injury, Seth managed to flee, eventually halting at the closest residence to contact the police and recount the incident. The local sheriff, who was conducting the investigation, found himself perplexed. The scene of the crime appeared so peculiar and irrational that it defied any similar cases within his recollection. In an urgent press release, he acknowledged that piecing together the entire sequence of events would be a challenging task for investigators.
I don't really know what all happened except a white male worked his way up here Apparently, he's a family member, but I'm not sure what relationship he is.
Following Seth Denton's apprehension, there arose a need to ascertain the motive behind the young man's ruthless treatment of his family members. To everyone's astonishment, a motive was promptly uncovered. Seth happened to be the eldest child of his mother, Toshi, whom she had given birth to during her early years. Her relationship with the boy's father had faltered, leading to his grandparents primarily assuming responsibility for his upbringing. Reports suggested that Toshi grappled with bipolar affective disorder and occasionally sought treatment at a clinic. It is conceivable that her son may have inherited this disorder as well. From childhood, Seth harbored a deep aversion towards his mother, whom he scarcely saw. As he matured, this sentiment transformed into outright hatred, a sentiment he often shared with friends and relatives. Upon graduating from high school, Seth opted to enlist in the military, and upon returning home a year later, he once more took up residence with his grandparents. However, it wasn't long before the young man resolved to embark on an independent journey and relocated to the city, where he rented a modest apartment with a friend. He secured employment at a local fast food establishment, although shortly before the tragic events unfolded, he lost his job. Seth received praise from both family and friends for his nonviolent nature, association with law-abiding individuals, and the absence of any prior aggressive tendencies. Nonetheless, investigators harbored suspicions that Seth's underlying resentment towards his mother and her current spouse lay at the heart of the crime. As per the investigative account, the events of that fateful day unfolded in the following sequence. At around 5:00 p.m., Seth drove his car to his grandparents' residence. Dressed in a camouflage jacket and carrying a semi-automatic rifle in his vehicle, he parked by the roadside and, armed, proceeded to approach the house, gaining entry through the rear entrance. Inside, Seth discharged multiple rounds, tragically ending the lives of his mother and grandmother while grievously injuring his stepfather. Curiously, he left his jacket and rifle behind at the back door before heading to his grandfather's home, imploring him to summon the police. The exact order of the shots fired remained elusive, as Seth vehemently denied any involvement. It remained puzzling why he chose to have his grandfather make the call to the authorities instead of making a swift getaway from the scene. It is presumed that his primary targets were his mother and stepfather, with his grandmother perhaps becoming an unintended witness. Key pieces of evidence implicating Seth included the discovery of his jacket and rifle at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his footwear, and bullets found in his car. Intriguingly, a substantial cache of approximately 100 bullets was recovered, raising questions about why such an abundance was necessary if his intent was to eliminate just 2 individuals. The timing of events added another layer of peculiarity. According to the grandfather's account, after they both entered the house and were confronted with the horrifying scene, Seth hastily departed. Curtis, his grandfather, secured the children and alerted the authorities before retrieving a firearm from his possession and subsequently catching up with his grandson, ultimately discharging 2 rounds. Notably, it wasn't until 2016 that Seth presented his version of the incident in court, a perspective previously unexplored. According to Seth, he had always shared a close bond with his grandparents, who had raised him. In contrast, he actively avoided encounters with his mother. As an adolescent, he often accompanied his grandfather to shooting ranges, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to enlist in the army. On that ill-fated day, Seth placed a call to his maternal aunt, Amanda, the younger sister of his mother, informing her of his intent to visit his grandparents, but expressing a desire to steer clear of his mother. Unbeknownst to him, Tasha and her husband were visiting her parents at that time. Amanda reassured Seth that he could visit without encountering his mother and stepfather. This testimony was corroborated by Amanda during the court proceedings, underscoring that Seth couldn't have been aware of Tasha and James' presence at Rose's residence. Seth had arrived at his grandfather's house with hopes of a day at the shooting range together, which was why he had brought along a rifle stocked with ample ammunition. Pulling up to the house, he retrieved the firearm and made his way directly to the trailer where his grandpa typically spent his time. Inside, Seth proudly displayed his rifle, engaging in a conversation about it. Subsequently, Curtis, his grandfather, began making his way towards the house, still holding the rifle, with Seth following closely behind. Seth had anticipated that his grandfather also had a rifle and expected him to join in for some target shooting fun. However, upon entering the room, Curtis abruptly opened fire, catching everyone present off guard and leaving them no time to react, flee, or take cover. Seth's legal team initially contemplated the possibility of Curtis suffering from temporary insanity, which might have led him to commit the shocking act of killing his own family members. However, this theory was swiftly dismissed in court as it seemed implausible. Despite Curtis having traces of the victim's blood on his clothing and shoes, he wasn't initially considered a suspect. The young man found himself facing the dire prospect of capital punishment for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. Remarkably, Curtis, his grandfather, remained a pivotal witness in the case, even after openly stating his readiness to harm his grandson on that fateful day. The court, for inexplicable reasons, deemed Curtis's actions as justified. Consequently, Curtis Rose was never taken into custody or interrogated as a suspect, and his account of the day's events was regarded as the sole truth. Furthermore, numerous critical details and inconsistencies were seemingly overlooked, and Seth's side of the story remained unexamined until a year and a half later. While most of the physical evidence seemed to align with Curtis's narrative, the investigation curiously ignored what lay beneath the surface. The primary argument presented in court was the apparent lack of motive for Mr. Rose to murder his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The notion of temporary insanity appeared dubious and implausible. The trial extended over a week, during which over 200 pieces of evidence were presented, and numerous witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, took the stand. The testimonies of both the grandfather and the grandson contradicted each other, casting a clear shadow of doubt on one of them. After days of intense deliberation, during which the jury openly acknowledged their profound emotional and physical exhaustion, they ultimately reached a unanimous verdict, harboring no doubt regarding the defendant's guilt on all counts. Consequently, Seth Denton was convicted of triple murder. However, following a comprehensive review of all the evidence and the circumstances surrounding this tragic event, the court opted to forego the death penalty, instead imposing a life sentence with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 50 years. Throughout the legal proceedings, Seth Denton steadfastly maintained his innocence. Currently, he is serving his sentence within a Tennessee prison. As for the orphan children of Tasha and James Milhorn, their welfare now rests in the hands of other family members, primarily Aunt Amanda and Grandpa Curtis. Thank you for your viewership. We invite you to subscribe to our channel, as we have many compelling stories in store for you in the future. Stay tuned.